You feel the effects of the agent?
Everything's moving.
Soldiers taking drugs. Whatever your views are on recreational drugs and drinking, most of us would assume that they wouldn't mix particularly well with military combat. Despite this, soldiers have used drugs more than you probably think. Here is a breakdown of drug use and alcohol abuse in the modern military. Number 1. Marijuana. Also known as cannabis. Marijuana is a psychoactive drug that has been used for recreational, medicinal, and spiritual purposes for thousands of years. In the 20th century, however, virtually every government in the world made the drug illegal. Despite this, marijuana has continued to be used all over the world by millions of people. Use of the drug has even been found in the military, with soldiers using the drug both legally and illegally during military conflicts. A large increase in use was seen in the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, where the drug was widely available.
Congressional investigators say the problem is skyrocketing away from any solution. Army authorities acknowledge that the crisis is real, and they're going all out to cope with it. Both groups are talking about marijuana and the extent to which American servicemen are using the drug in Vietnam.
Before this, however, cannabis had been used for several reasons by U.S. military personnel. A 1909 military manual from the Mounted Service School recommended using cannabis for treating abdominal pain in horses. During the First World War, military doctors also recommended that the American Expeditionary Force carry cannabis tablets to treat headaches, insomnia, and cramps. As well as this, American troops stationed in Panama were reported to have been using the drug as early as 1916. Thousands of U.S. troops also smoked weed at the same time while fighting Pancho Villa in Mexico. Since these early reports, marijuana has continued to be popular among American troops, especially when stationed in locations where the drug is easily accessible. In Vietnam, this was definitely the case, and marijuana became the second most used drug by American troops after alcohol.
Grass is as plentiful in Vietnam as sea rations. One pipeful, which the soldiers call a bowl, can easily take care of 5 or 6 men.
At the start of the war, rates of usage in troops were similar to the rates of civilians back home in the U.S. However, usage among soldiers soon overtook, with a report just after the war finding that 34% of American troops had used marijuana in Vietnam from 1967 to 1971. Possibly the most famous case of marijuana usage in Vietnam is the crazy case of Peter Lemon. Born in Canada in 1950, Lemon's family relocated to Michigan when he was very young. While still a teenager, Lemon volunteered to enter the United States Army and soon found himself in Vietnam. Like many U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, Lemon and his fellow troops often smoked marijuana. On April 1, 1970, Lemon's unit was attacked by North Vietnamese soldiers while under the influence of cannabis. Tasked with defending a small base, Lemon and roughly 200 others were attacked by a Vietnamese unit containing almost twice as many troops. Just before knowing that an attack was imminent, Lemon and his friends had been smoking heavily in order to ease the tension. When the base came under attack, Lemon engaged the enemy with machine gun and rifle fire, grenades, and finally hand-to-hand combat. Despite being wounded by shrapnel, Lemon carried a seriously injured comrade to an aid station before being wounded again by enemy fire while returning to his position. Finally, Lemon collapsed, but refused medical evacuation until his more seriously wounded comrades had been saved. For his bravery, Lemon received a Medal of Honor. He is perhaps the only recipient to have achieved this while under the influence of marijuana.
Aren't you worried about maybe getting attacked and not being able to react properly?
No, nobody usually seems to worry. That's about the last thing that's worried about.
Usage wasn't just high in Vietnam, with cannabis use becoming common among American soldiers at home and in Europe. In Vietnam, the levels of weed usage became so high that the army began to clamp down. At the height of this clampdown, 1,000 GIs were being arrested per week for marijuana possession. The army also began destroying marijuana fields across the country. Number 2. Psychedelics. The use of psychedelics on the battlefield has been a topic of study and debate more than you might think. While supplying your own troops with psychedelics has never seemed like a good idea, some scientists have explored the idea of using the drug on the enemy. James Ketchum was one such scientist who believed that this technique could prove to be invaluable on the battlefield. Ketchum was a psychiatrist and U.S. Army medical officer who worked for almost a decade on the American government's top-secret psychochemical warfare program. Ketchum's goal was to find a way to incapacitate the minds of the enemy by drugging them with strong hallucinogens. He aimed to create a cloud of confusion by releasing the hallucinogenic gases into the air that would render entire battlefield units useless without taking a single life. For years, studies regarding the effects of psychedelics were carried out on American troops. Similar programs were carried out by other nations also.
The first effects of the drug make their appearance. 2 Marines were reported to the troop commander for insubordination, no one realizing that their behavior was due to the first effects of the drug.
The British government began similar experiments on their troops in the 60s, where soldiers were given acid and asked to carry out basic military exercises at the Porton-Down Chemical Weapons Research Establishment.
They no longer take cover, they relax and begin to giggle. At this time, one man is more severely affected than the others, losing all contact with reality, dropping his rifle, and becoming unable to take any further part in the operation.
Results in the UK were similar to those in the US. Soldiers on LSD were more or less completely useless.
Radio communication at the beaches has become difficult, if not impossible. Men with no specific task to perform have relapsed into laughter and inconsequential behavior.
These findings didn't prevent soldiers from taking it themselves in Vietnam, with 31% of American troops using LSD, mescaline, or psychedelic mushrooms while fighting in the country. Number 3. Amphetamines and meth. First synthesized in 1887, amphetamines are a group of stimulant drugs that speed up the central nervous system, hence the common use street name, speed. The potentially useful effects of these drugs weren't discovered until the late 20s, but just a few years later, amphetamines were being sold inside inhalers as a decongestant. Amphetamines were also used by both the Allied and Axis forces during the Second World War. Hitler himself famously used a lot of amphetamines, becoming addicted in late 1942. He was prescribed the drug along with a cocktail of others by his personal physician, including barbiturates, opiates, and cocaine. The effects of the stimulants boosted performance in troops, with Allied bomber pilots taking amphetamines to keep them awake during long flights. This trend continued into more recent conflicts. A friendly fire incident in 2002 in Afghanistan where an American pilot killed 4 Canadian troops was blamed by the pilot on his use of amphetamine. Although this claim was largely rejected, the use of amphetamines is no longer approved by the U.S. Air Force. As well as marijuana and LSD, amphetamines were also used heavily in the Vietnam War, with American armed forces using 225 million tablets of stimulants between 1966 and 1969. In 1938, methamphetamine began being marketed on a large scale in Germany under the brand name Pervitin.
Pervitin reduces fear, it reduces your need to sleep, and it makes you more aggressive. So these 3 reasons seem perfect for the German army in 1940.
German soldiers started taking the drug in massive quantities for the first few years of World War II. Despite its initial effectiveness, the Nazis had to cut back on its usage due to the horrific withdrawal symptoms and addiction issues. One famous story of meth in warfare highlights the dangers of taking the drug in combat situation. Finnish soldier Eimo Koivunen was fighting the Soviets in 1944 when his ski patrol was surrounded and attacked. Koivunen's patrol was forced to flee, but after skiing for some time, he became tired and unable to continue. In desperate need of energy, Koivunen consumed his patrol's entire supply of Army-issued methamphetamine. He received a short burst of energy, but soon entered a state of delirium and passed out. When he woke up, he had become separated from his patrol and was left without supplies. Over the next week, Koivunen managed to survive the freezing temperatures, another run-in with Soviet forces, and a landmine explosion. He skied for over 400 kilometers and stayed in a ditch for a week before he was finally rescued. When taken to a hospital, doctors measured his heart rate at 200 beats per minute. It is debatable whether the methamphetamine almost caused Koivunen's death or allowed him to survive. Either way, giving your troops meth on the battlefield is generally not considered wise today. Number 4. Alcohol. Booze and battles have had a close relationship since ancient times. Even the Romans and ancient Greeks would drink before combat thousands of years ago. In the last century or so, however, the question has arisen as to whether giving your soldiers copious amounts of alcohol while they are in charge of a loaded weapon is a good idea. Most military commanders today think not, and as such, booze in the military has died out massively in recent times. Even the age-old tradition of drinking rum in the Navy has now been stopped, with the US Navy banning alcohol on ships in 1914 and the British Navy following suit worryingly late in 1970. The change was met with widespread outrage among sailors.
Supposed to be operating all this very technical equipment, yet this is officers and chiefs and petty officers that operate this. We can still carry out our job, I'm sure they can. There's no need to stop the tot at all.
The senior ranks and officers still allowed to drink at lunchtime. And surely an officer is a more technical person than we are.
Yes, that's right. The British Navy was still supplying its sailors with rum on board battleships after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. At least we can be grateful he was sober. Alcohol has historically been used to inspire bravery in soldiers. The term Dutch courage comes from the British practice of drinking Dutch gin before battle to drown out the fear of death. Despite this, being drunk also affects decision-making, hand-eye coordination, and motor skills, making it a poor drink to take with you into a life and death situation. That's not to say that all armies around the world are now dry. Alcohol abuse in the Russian army has recently caused firearms violations and car accidents in the war in Ukraine.
The Ministry of Defense has said that a significant minority of the 200,000 Russian troops that have been killed in Ukraine have died for non-combat reasons. The Army's failures on the battlefield have been linked to a lack of training and equipment since the start of the war, but now British intel says that alcohol's to blame too.
Russian officials have even tried to prevent their troops from buying alcohol in some occupied territories, as heavy drinking has become a serious issue. Ukrainian forces have attributed poor performances in Russian soldiers to their excessive consumption of alcohol. This is an issue that has plagued Russian troops for some time, with similar reports coming from Russia's war with Japan that occurred over 100 years ago. Number 5. Heroin. Chances are you've also heard of heroin. The opioid substance is possibly the most infamous drug of them all, and while it gives strong euphoric effects, it is considered to be highly addictive and dangerous. Despite these risks, heroin and other opioids have also historically been used by soldiers on the battlefield. Studies have shown that approximately 34% of American soldiers took heroin while in Vietnam, with 20% becoming dependent on the drug.
It's the only way you can feel good in Nam, you know?
How available is it?
In Nam? I used to buy off when he was 89 years old.
Similar studies have also shown that users in Vietnam were of many personality types and socioeconomic backgrounds. Soldiers using the drug would typically take it with friends to escape the horrors of war, which contrasted to the typical use back in the US who took the drug alone. Generally, soldiers would smoke, snort, or ingest the drug rather than inject it.
Drugs were a gift to a lot of these soldiers that were knee-deep in horror every day and saw the most repugnant things you could possibly imagine.
The issue became so widespread that the Army began a mandatory urine testing program to detect heroin in 1971. Unlike amphetamines, heroin lacked any positive military applications other than numbing the soldiers to the horrors of war. As such, it was important for the military to limit its use. Thanks for watching our quick history of drug and alcohol use in the military. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe to History 101.